Some people will pluck the fruit from an apple tree for its sweet taste and the crispness of its texture, while others may prefer the more sour and perhaps slightly bitter experience from an orange tree. I myself would like to partake from the telemetry. Hello and welcome to the Throne Nest Citizen channel. I'm Cody James Casey, and today I want to talk to you about the telemetry app on the RSI website. This is going to be the first part of a multi-part series where I'll be going over some of the cool apps that CIG has built to support Star Citizen. So before we begin, I just want to start with the definition. What is telemetry? It could kind of vary a little bit when you kind of go from industry to industry. The term is used slightly differently in different spots, but basically it is the process of recording and transmitting the readings of an instrument. In the context of Star Citizen, that instrument is your computer. So the telemetry app will be measuring the recordings that your computer makes and transmitting them back to Star Citizen's servers. So in order to make Star Citizen work as best as possible, it makes sense that CIG would want to record what type of hardware people are using to run the game and the performance that they're getting with those hardware setups. That data can be used to help establish minimum and recommended tech specs for running Star Citizen, and it can also be used to generally get a sense of what types of PCs the user base is playing on. So in front of us here, we have the Star Citizen telemetry app. You can find it at robertspaceindustries.com/telemetry, and you can also get to it by going to the telemetry link under the apps section from the RSI website. The telemetry app is divided into a couple different sections, and we're going to go over them one by one. To start off, let's go to the My Specs section of this app on the top right. Here you can see a bunch of information about your specs when you're running Star Citizen. First, we have GPU score, which is defined as rating of your GPU's performance and compute shader performance with a focus on speed of integer and floating point math, as well as incoherent branching effectiveness and memory throughput. What's all that mean? Well, it's kind of just saying how good your GPU is at being a GPU and performing the operations it needs to run the game efficiently. What this doesn't really give us is how exactly CIG is getting this number, right? Like, how am I at 211? We don't really know. There is some sort of black box equation that they're using to sort of arrive at this number, but it's okay because it's just kind of a relative number that you can compare to other users based on their hardware. Below that is CPU score, rating of your CPU's performance in a combined test of speed of integer and floating point math, as well as branching effectiveness and memory throughput. Same deal here. It's just a measurement of how performant your CPU is compared to other people's CPUs. Game settings will show you the quality level chosen in the game settings menu upon last game session. This includes graphics, physics, sound, and more. You can see that I'm running the game at ultra high. I imagine that if you tweaked the settings a little bit and didn't quite use their setting templates, it would probably just round to the nearest one. That's my best guess. I'm not 100% positive. Below that is RAM, the total amount of system memory installed. So I'm running at 32 gigabytes of RAM. Next is ping, which is the average latency between players, client, and the game server. So this basically measures how fast your computer talks to the server when running the game on average, versus the community average, which is 68 milliseconds. So I have better ping than the average. Below this is the disk, which will show you if you're running the game on an SSD or a solid state drive, or an HDD or a hard disk drive. And next to that is the average loading time, which will be a measurement of the average time for the game to initialize. So in my case, it takes around 100 seconds for me to load into the game. I assume that this means when I join the persistent universe and I'm spawning into my bed. Below this is the community average for disk and loading time data. I think this is busted a little bit. This doesn't read right to me. you can see that both after SSD and HDD are 0.0%. I believe that this is intended to show what percentage of the community is using SSD versus HDD drives, and I believe that the 82 milliseconds for loading time and 237 milliseconds for loading time is actually meant to be seconds. That kind of makes sense to me. So in other words, the community members who are using SSD drives would have an average loading time of 82 seconds, and the community members who are using hard disk drives will have an average loading time of 237 seconds. I might be wrong there. There's no way for me to really be 100% sure that that's what they're trying to show, but it's the only thing that really makes sense to me. So while we're talking about loading times, let's just jump down to the loading times section next. This will show you, it will basically let you compare two patches in terms of loading times. So you can see that for 3.12 over the last 24 hours, the community average loading time is 160 seconds, which is greater. It's going up, I guess. It's trending upwards. I assume that that's what that arrow means. The minimum loading time was measured at 32 seconds, and the maximum loading time was measured at 401 seconds, compared to the 3.11 branch, where the average loading time was 178 seconds, which with a minimum of 31 seconds and a maximum of 477 seconds. You can go back in time and see how this compares to other branches. I believe that the first branch they started measuring this for was 3.7, where the average loading time was only 62 seconds. And then when you go to 3.8, it went up to 125 seconds, which is just about double. And then 3.9, it went down to 115 seconds. 3.10, it went up to 158 seconds on average. And then 3.11, it went up to 178 seconds. And so now at 3.12, we're down a little bit to 160 seconds. So we're kind of trending upwards, but maybe wobbling a little bit. I imagine that based on the amount of stuff there is to load in the game, it kind of makes sense to me that the time might be going up from patch to patch to some degree. But, there might be a ton of different factors contributing to that. So below the loading time section is the stability score section. Stability score is calculated by disconnections per hour per average concurrency. A lower stability score is a reflection of a more stable branch. As a general rule, a patch is considered stable when it reaches the stability score of 0.2 or less. So let's just talk about that for one quick second here. The disconnections per hour per average concurrency. So what that kind of means is how many people are being disconnected every hour divided by how many average people are online at the same time. So in other words, if you have a small amount of disconnections and a large amount of people online, you're going to have a higher stability score. If you have, the same amount of people online at the same time and you get more disconnections per hour, that stability score is going to be going down. If you have the same amount of people being disconnected per hour, but you have a whole ton more playing at the same time, that's going to be a better stability score, which is going to be lower. Does that kind of make sense? So if you look at 3.11 here, it has a stability score of 0.13. And in fact, I think 3.11 is the first time that they're at least publicly showing the stability score here. Versus what they're claiming to be the stability score of 3.12 within the last 24 hours. If I change it to the last week, it's still 0. I'm not sure the granularity that they're trying to measure here. It seems that with 3.11, they're at least showing us to the 100th place. So it seems strange to me that the stability score would be 0, which means that it's like very, very, very stable. I would imagine it to be, I would imagine that it probably would be a little bit higher, but we don't really have any insight into exactly what the numbers are in terms of how many people are disconnecting per hour versus the average concurrency. And truthfully, there could always be the case where this data is being measured improperly or being displayed improperly, just like the community average up in the My Specs section. Alrighty, so I want to talk about the FPS distribution section of the app now. I saved this I saved this for last because it's kind of the most complicated, and I also wanted to sort of define the CPU score and GPU score before we jump in here because it's used in this table here. Let's start off by looking at the key, which is this section right here that shows the colors and the what frames per second they're associated with. So the key kind of goes from purple through blue into green. The more purple it is, the lower FPS you're experiencing. As you move through blue up to green, that FPS number goes up. The purple dot is the measurement of what is the minimum configuration that Star Citizen should be played at. The green dot is the recommended configuration, and then the orange dot is your configuration, or at least what is recorded on, when you're playing. So let's start with the by users section right here. So the by users section is showing the percentage of users and what FPS that section of users is experiencing. So you can see that 30% of users are experiencing 30 to 39 FPS, while 33% of users are experiencing 50 to 59, or rather 40 to 49. The colors are pretty close. Only 2% of users are experiencing 60 to 69%. Below the by users and the key sections is the by computer specs section, which will show you the FPS being experienced based on the computer specs that are being recorded. So in other words, what type of hardware configurations tend to experience what types of frames per second. On the vertical axis is the CPU score, which we went over earlier. And on the bottom the horizontal axis is the GPU score. So you can see that the minimum configuration that you should have to play Star Citizen is a CPU score of 50 and a GPU score of 75, while the recommended is that you have at least a CPU score of 150 and a GPU score of 150. So you can see that my configuration has a CPU score of 120 rather, and a GPU score of 211. So I kind of fall in this square right here. When you look at this graph in a whole, you can see that generally from the bottom left, right, lower CPU and GPU scores, you're going to have worse performance. So you're going to have darker colors, the dark purple, the darker blues, and the better your CPU and GPU get, you will trend to better performance. So you'll start seeing better hardware having more frames per second, which makes sense. You will notice that there are a ton of discrepancies in here, right? Like why is this person over here, like the people who have this type of hardware, why are they experiencing an average FPS of 36.9 when the CPU score above them, again, I'm gonna wait pop up, is getting only 21.3 frames per second? Well, it's a good question, and there's a lot of stuff that goes into how many frames per second you will get. It's not just going to be based entirely on the CPU and GPU that you have, but there are a ton of caveats, which they have a little caveats section right here. So it basically says the data, all data presented on the public telemetry page reflects the data CIG receives from the clients while playing the game and connected to the server. This data is used to assess and improve performance across a variety of hardware. Variables affecting FPS. Since user-controlled variables can greatly impact FPS, there is no way to predict client performance. As such, it is entirely possible to experience lower FPS on machines with high GPU and CPU scores, or to experience higher FPS on machines with low GPU and CPU scores. Let's take a look at those user-controlled variables for a second. So the following user-controlled variables may impact FPS. The game resolution and quality level, what settings you're running the game at, basically. Unsanctioned modification of CVARs. CVARs are these console variables that you could input into the game to have different things happen. There's a whole list of CVARs that are valid for the CryEngine, which is basically kind of what Star Citizen is using. I believe they're using Amazon's Lumberyard engine, which is based off of CryEngine. So it probably has, the same sort of set of CVARs. Running the game without using the fastest GPU installed in systems with multiple GPUs available. For example, if you have an onboard GPU and a discrete GPU, or maybe you have like if they're SLI'd maybe, the game will look for the discrete GPU by default in situations. So, the game will use the discrete GPU, but it won't necessarily use your onboard GPU. So, if your onboard GPU happens to be better, you're not really getting the advantage of that. And I guess Star Citizen doesn't appear, based on the sentence at least, to be utilizing the multiple GPUs. Other programs running in the background that utilize CPU or GPU. So if you're running all sorts of other programs like OBS or Discord, or if you're streaming or playing YouTube videos or recording your gameplay, that could impact your performance. The available system and video memory. So, again, like how much memory do you have installed into your system? How much RAM, right? 32 gigabytes in my case, or video memory, which is how much memory your graphics card has. And how many other apps you're running, that might be sucking up the usage of all that memory. Overriding application settings within the video driver. So I guess you could, I personally don't know how to really do this, but I guess it makes sense that you can be kind of futzing with how the video for Star Citizen is displayed on your screen. So you might be adding filtering or changing the sample rate or stuff. If you're running the game with Reshade or SweetFix or other pieces of software that will sort of change how the game looks on your client. If you're running the game without data drivers, the current load on the server and gameplay situation. So if there's like a ton of stuff happening on the server and it's being overloaded, that could affect your experience. The current load on, I just read that one. Running third-party apps that hook into DXGI or D3D to display overlays, etc. I think this might be for like third-party apps that are displaying overlays on top of Star Citizen. So they're kind of like hooking into some technology that will like embed those in-game, I guess. I'm not honestly familiar with what these are. Or third-party apps modifying the behavior of video cards. So if you're tweaking your video cards, like if you're overclocking, stuff like that. This is the list that they give, but I can imagine that there are probably endless other things that could be affecting the performance of your FPS. Is your computer clean, right? Is it full of dust and your computer is like overheating, right? There's probably a whole bunch of stuff. Going back to those caveats, reading the heat map. So like I said, it's presented the general performance across a range of hardware. The data shown is an aggregate of all clients running the game. The sample machines described are examples of the top configurations that generate the CPU and GPU scores in the absence of other factors. So when you click on one of these squares, you'll see these top three lists of hardware. So I believe that what that means is the top performing person in the square is using this Intel Core i7-5930K CPU at 3.5 gigahertz with an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 980 Ti, right? And then the second and third top performing rigs are using the second and third lists in this data here. Okay, my stats. So looking at the my stats block, which we did before, this is just basically saying the same thing that pop-up said. And then it says that it can measure, I guess, performance over time. To see how your hardware stacks up, get the latest game build, you must have been running Alpha 3.2 or higher for us to record your data. So I guess they're only recording since Alpha 3.2. And then the stats here are all pulled from your last game session. So if you have hardware and you swap out for newer hardware, you have to run the game, and then after you do that, this my specs section will update, which makes sense. Another thing that is interesting here is at the top of the screen, you can see this data for different versions of the game and different game settings and resolution. So for me, if I change the game settings to ultra high, because that's what I run the game at, and then I change my resolution to 2560 by 1440, which is what I run the game at, you can see that the performance of machines running at those settings differ a little bit. Additionally, you can display outlying data, which will show you just a bigger picture here. So, there is probably very few machines recorded in these extreme ranges, but still the recordings are happening. So by default, they just don't show you the outlying data. Okay, so what? So what's all this mean? What can I do with this? Well, if I am looking to improve my experience in Star Citizen, I can use the data here to get a sense of what parts on my computer I might be able to swap out in order to potentially get a better experience. So you can see that my specs, the orange dot, show that I far exceed the minimum required GPU settings, but I'm under the recommended CPU settings, right? So at least right, I'm above the minimum required in both, but I'm below the recommended in terms of CPU. So my first thought might be, well, if I want the game to run better for me, maybe I just get a faster CPU, right? Well, it's interesting because if I click on my square here, I can see that people with the score that I have tend to run the game at 40.9 frames per second. But if you improve the CPU score, you're getting 43.7 frames per second, 40.7, 47.2, 48 frames per second, and then 48.7. It's not a huge difference, right? I'm only getting 40.9 frames per second on average, supposedly. But if I just get a better CPU, I might only be getting 48.7 frames per second on average. So by just getting a better CPU based on this data, it is likely the case where I might not get all that much improved performance. Instead, I would have to probably, if I'm shooting for the squares that are lighter blue and green, I would have to increase my CPU and my GPU to kind of land in these squares. Right? So that's kind of interesting because it just makes you think about what types of hardware you should be investing into. In my case, it looks like I might need to be upgrading my CPU and GPU, at least based on this data. And like I said before, there's all those caveats and so many variables, and you can't just use this chart and assume that if your computer will fall into a certain category that you're going to get a certain FPS. These are just the measured averages, so you really have to be careful. So if we took a look real quick at these green slots here, these people are getting an average of 64.6 frames per second. And if I just look at the top couple machines here, we can see that for graphics cards, we have a 2080 Super, a 3070, a 2080 Ti. For the CPUs, they're using some of the new i9 processors, and then the Ryzen 12-core processor here, the 3900 XT. And in this square over here, we see well, actually, we're missing a GPU, right? So that might be affecting something here. But at least the top two rigs are using a 2080 Ti and a 3080, and they're using the Intel i9 9900K, which is an overclockable CPU at 3.60 gigahertz, and then the Ryzen 7 at 5800X 8-core processor. So there's so many variables that can go into this. And this really should just be used to sort of give you a sense, in terms of broad strokes, what might be going on and how you might be able to improve your performance. But it also gives you a sense of just what other people in the community might be experiencing. I know for a fact that I'm not getting 40.9 frames per second. I'm getting much lower than that when I play the game. And it's probably because a lot of the time I'm recording footage at the same time. I'm running the game at super high settings in a resolution that is, pretty high. But because I'm using a super ultra wide monitor, I'm also running the game in borderless Windows mode, which I believe is more taxing than if it was a full screen version of running it in full screen. Along with all that stuff, I'm also running a bunch of other apps like Discord. I'm surfing the internet. I'm watching a YouTube video. So my experience does not quite reflect what the average for this square is. So just food for thought. I thought this was an interesting app. There's a lot here that I've been looking into, and it's kind of inspiring me to maybe think about upgrading my computer. Maybe I could get a hold of a 3080 someday, right? Maybe sometime this year. I know that Intel is getting ready to drop the new line of processors. So maybe we'll see what happens after those processors drop and people have had time to kind of buy them up a bit. Are we going to see a greater percentage of people with better configurations, or as more people join the game, you're going to have more and more computers joining in? Are we just going to kind of see the stuff average out and stay around the same as Star Citizen continues being developed? Are they going to add in more content which makes the game perform worse, or are they going to optimize the game which makes it perform better? There are so many things that can happen here, and I think this app is really just an example of, knowledge is power, and it just helps to kind of measure these things, get a sense of where you fall on that spectrum, and you can use that knowledge to your advantage however you really want. In my case, I'm definitely going to be upgrading my computer, both CPU and GPU, hopefully very shortly. I hope that was enjoyable and informative. If you have any thoughts on that, please leave them below. How has your experience in the game matched up to where you fall here? Are you seeing the frames per second that are being reported for your Square, or are you seeing something different? What kind of other factors might be affecting your experience? Drop those thoughts below. Let's get some conversations going. As always, I've been Cody James Casey. Thanks for coming by Throwing a Citizen, and we'll see you next time.